All right, welcome to the part 2 lecture of creating our perspective drawing. Now, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do in this second part is I'm going to create a light source. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot up here, and that's going to be where my light is coming from. So now I know where I want to put my shadow. So this side of my building is going to have my core shadow, and the other side of my building is going to have the mid-tone shadow. So I'm just going to fill that in now. It's important to try to keep your shading as even as possible, and I know it's really hard to keep it even, and a lot of the times you're not going to be able to make it perfect, and that's fine. Just try to keep it as even as possible. Sometimes this might mean that you have to go over it with multiple layers. It's always important to start with your biggest things first when you start drawing anything or shading things in. So always start with your biggest shapes, your biggest surfaces that you have to shade in, and then move down to smaller detail. So now we're adding in our mid-tone shadow. And notice that I'm avoiding everything on that side except for that one surface, so that if I need to, I can come back in and add different values to those. Then I'm going to go ahead and add my core shadow, which will then fade into my mid-tone shadow on that rounded cylinder. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in my core shadow on this edge since it's on that side of my perspective. I'm going to go ahead and darken in that window just a little bit. And now I can go ahead and add my core shadow to this side of my wall since it's also on the side that has my core shadow on it. And then I'll shade in this top area. And you notice the top area is a little bit lighter than my side wall. The reason for that is because it's getting bounce light, and we'll go over what bounce light is later. But for now, all you need to understand is that that's bounce light, and that's why it's brighter. Now I'm going ahead and adding in my mid-tone shadow onto this side of my wall. And then I'm going to go ahead and shade in that top area since it's going to be a little bit darker because it's curving in to the other side of my wall. Then I'm going to go ahead and darken this bottom area. This isn't any type of shadow. This is just the actual value of that part of my building. Now I'm going to go ahead and darken in that window and just make sure that everything is nice and even. Then I'm going to go ahead and darken in my roof because that's also the value of my roof. I'm going to go ahead and erase this and reshade it in because I want to keep the top area a little bit light. And then I'm just going to add in a little bit of detail in there. Then I'm going to start shading in this box over here. So this side gets the mid-tone, and then same with this other box. And then the other side gets the darker core shadow. I'm going to go ahead and grab another pencil and fill that in even better. Then I'm going to add a little bit of a cast shadow coming from underneath this white part of my box. And here in a second, we're going to go ahead and extend that out. But for now, we're just going to add in that shadow. And so you'll see right here, I'm erasing out these edges of that white part of my box so I can push that out just a little bit further so it looks more like a ledge. And then I'm going to add that same drop shadow on the other side too. I'm going to start adding some shadow into my plants now. So this side of my plants is going to get a lot more shadow than my other side because the other side is going to be getting hit by the light. So I'm only adding shadow to the left side of my plant. Then I'm going to darken the whole thing because I want the values of my leaves to be darker. And I'll go back in there and add some darker detail just so it stands out more. I also want to add some shadow underneath the plant. And then I'm going to redraw that contouring line so it stands out even more. Then I'm going to go ahead and darken these lines just so they stand out more also. And now we can start working on our tree. So I'm just darkening in that trunk. And then I'm going to go ahead and add some shadow to the bulk of my leaves. And just like any type of drawing, it's always important to work the whole image at the same time. So you don't want to overwork one area. You want to work it for a while and then move on to another part. So you'll see me switch back and forth between different parts of the drawing throughout the drawing. Like right here, I've switched back over to my boxes. Now I'm going to start putting in a little bit of a lighter value on my floor because I don't want it to be completely white. And now I'm going to start adding some detail into my door. So I'm just freehanding the perspective and trying to follow about where that perspective line would be for each one of these little squares on the door. And then I'm going to add some shadow edges to that. And I just want to darken that door just a little bit more. It's important to go over everything again. If things start to become less defined, you want to go back and define them. Then I'm just going to add a little bit of detail around this window, so it's not just a circle window, but it has maybe some paint around the circle. I'm going to do the same thing for the roof line. Just add a line across that roof line, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Now I'm going to go ahead and start adding in my cast shadow. So I'm drawing a very light line from each top corner of my drawing, or of my house. And I'm trying to stay away from drawing through the house. I just want to draw at the other end where I need to see those lines. And then I'm going to go ahead and find where that light source is on my horizon line, and then draw my crossing lines, which connect with each corner of my building. And I'm trying to figure out where that peak is going to be. So I draw a line through that bottom corner, and then I need to go ahead and draw a line through my other corner. So there's my other point. And then I need to go ahead and draw my third point. And my third point, I'm actually just going to have to guess where it is because it's the point for the peak of my roof. And so I'm just about guessing where that is. But I'm also deciding that it's just going to fade out by the time I get to that point where you see that peak, and so I'm not even going to worry about it. I'm just going to go ahead and start adding in my cast shadow. And like I said, that cast shadow is going to slowly fade out as it gets to the other side. And since this box is in the way, the cast shadow is actually going to be cast over it. And so that's why the cast shadow is coming up like it is onto the box. I'll continue to fill that in. Then I need to go ahead and create the cast shadow for this box here. And I don't need to create it for my other box because it's covered by the shadow of the building already. So I only have to worry about this box that's sticking out over the edge of that cast shadow. So then I'll figure out where each one of those points are, and then I'll go ahead and fill that in with the same cast shadow, and it'll slowly blend into my other cast shadow. And since that box is in the shadow too, I went ahead and darkened the whole white area of it. And I'm going to start erasing some of these lines, these guidelines that I no longer need. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start adding a little bit of detail onto my ground. So we added in a few extra perspective lines on the ground, so that way we can see where that perspective is. And so now we can go ahead and lightly sketch in sort of some bricks or rocks on the ground, and they'll be in the correct perspective. So as long as we're about following those lines that are crisscrossing, we should be good, and it will help create more of a ground plane for our drawing. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of detail in the background, so some small little houses. And just like we learned before in the course, everything in the background is going to be a lot smaller because it's far away. So we're creating space, and we're also making it really light, so we're using the value technique to create that space. And we're also only adding very minimal detail So you kind of get the idea that there's some houses with some chimneys and doors, but we don't really go into great detail because we're trying to create that illusion of space. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, so just a very simple shape, kind of like a house. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in some clouds in there. And I'm using the side of my pencil to create this effect where I can create a nice shadow and then create the edge of my cloud. And then I'm going to go ahead and darken in my sky just a little bit. And it's going to make a gradient into my white. I'll do the same thing on the other side, so that will slowly turn into a white. Alright, and now I went ahead and I cut off all the areas that were outside of my 60% square, and I also cut off a little bit of the bottom to create more of a composition for my drawing. And so now that brings us to the end of this drawing. So in this drawing, you were able to see how I created an entire building and the landscape around it just by using the things we've learned up to this point, which is values, lights and shadows, contrast, perspective, and using shapes to create a finished drawing. I really hope that you learned something from this lecture by watching me draw this picture, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Thanks for watching.